Our final group of protozoa pathogens are the apicomplexan pathogens. Remember, these protozoa have no form of motility, so they're non-motile. And you can see there's a few different ones. So the first one we're going to talk about is called Plasmodium. So Plasmodium is the genus name of this apicomplexan protozoa. Plasmodium species cause malaria. And there are actually 5 different species of Plasmodium that cause malaria. What differs about these species is the location where we find them. So we find different protozoal species in different parts of the world. And also the timeline of progression of the disease is slightly different for each one. Like some of them might cycle through the life cycle in 48 hours, some of them might be 24 hours. So they all are slightly different in those ways. But all of these Plasmodium species are carried by the same insect vector, and that vector is always a female. It has to be a female Anopheles mosquito. So these mosquitoes are the primary carriers of Plasmodium. Now, because Plasmodium can replicate inside red blood cells, it is possible for someone to get Plasmodium through a blood transfusion. It also can pass mother to fetus. As you can see by these numbers, 300 to 500 million new cases each year and 2 million deaths each year. This is no joke. This is not like a minor illness. We see this is one of the most serious and prevalent diseases on our planet. Plasmodium has one of the most complicated life cycles out of any pathogen, and it's important to understand this life cycle. So the first portion of the life cycle is this female Anopheles mosquito is carrying this what we call sporozoite. So the Plasmodium is in a sporozoite stage, and from there the sporozoite enters to the human when the mosquito takes a bite, a blood meal from the human. From there, the sporozoites immediately travel to the human liver. So stage 1 you can consider sporozoite stage in the mosquito. Stage 2, the liver stage. Once in the liver, the sporozoites start dividing or undergoing a process we call schizogeny, where they replicate. And in the liver, they form the merozoite stage. Once in the merozoite stage, and once they've replicated, merozoites are going to exit the liver, and they're going to go into the third major stage. The third major stage is now the merozoites are going to enter the red blood cells. And I'm talking thousands of these merozoites get into the red blood cells. Once in the red blood cells, the merozoites convert into trophozoites, and they multiply even more inside the red blood cell. Now here's where the major signs and symptoms of malaria happen. Once in the red blood cell, once they multiply, the trophozoites cause the red blood cells to burst. And it's not like a little staggering event. It's not like a couple blood cells burst here and there. They all burst basically at the same time because all of these Plasmodium are undergoing the same life cycle. So many red blood cells burst at the same time, and this triggers a really strong immune response. The immune system is going to freak out when it sees all these blood cells burst. And from there, the body will go into a very high fever. So the first major stage, when the blood cells burst, the person will get a high fever. Once this fever comes on, the second stage is they'll start sweating. Obviously, when the body temperature gets too high, you sweat. And then now that there's a lot of sweating, the person goes into the third stage, which is chills. And basically this cycles throughout the full stage of infection. Whenever the trophozoites enter another stage into the bloodstream, red blood cells burst, and then this cycles again. And like I mentioned, each species of Plasmodium may slightly differ in the timing of this, but no matter what, we're going to see these 3 characteristic signs. Now that the red blood cells have burst, the merozoites differentiate into gametocytes. So some of the red blood cells actually don't burst, and those are the ones that are carrying the gametocytes or the gametes. These are the sex cells of the Plasmodium. But the Plasmodium cannot sexually reproduce in a human. It only can sexually reproduce in the Anopheles mosquito. So another mosquito, another female Anopheles bites the human, takes up the red blood cells with the gametocytes, and from there, the Plasmodium will sexually reproduce and the cycle will start over again. Now, the most dangerous aspects of the disease, malaria, other than the fever, sweat, and chill cycles I told you about, is because a lot of the red blood cells are bursting, the individual that's infected can actually develop anemia. Even more serious is this condition called sticky red blood cells. Because red blood cells are being depleted very fast, they actually become sticky, and this is the most serious complication because the sticky red blood cells can actually block venules or very small veins in the body, and this can actually block blood flow to certain organs, leading to hemorrhaging. Where it becomes most serious is when it blocks the kidneys, and the individual will go into renal failure. It can block lungs, leading to edema, coma, and death. Now, these signs and symptoms are most likely to be seen in very young children, like under the age of 5. Another complication could be the individual could get an enlarged spleen or an enlarged liver because the immune system is trying to clean up all those dead red blood cells. It actually can cause an immune response in addition to all this. Diagnosis of malaria, we're typically looking for that characteristic chills, fever, sweating cycle I told you about. Also, we can take a blood smear and look for the actual trophozoite in the blood cells. Treatment is, there's a large class of drugs called quinine drugs. There's chloroquine. The problem is some strains of Plasmodium are developing resistance to chloroquine, so it can't always be used. Depending on the location maybe an individual's traveling to, we might actually prescribe chloroquine as a prophylaxis to try to prevent Plasmodium disease. That's actually something we can do. There's many other drugs also out there that they use as a preventative measure. The best and most important way we try to lower the number of malaria cases is basically just control the disease. And ways we can do that, of course, try to lower the number of mosquitoes. In the past, they tried to mass spray insecticides to try to get rid of the mosquitoes. Unfortunately, that ended up making the mosquitoes more resistant to the insecticides, and now they're back more than ever. We're using nets to block the mosquitoes, especially while sleeping, using insect repellents, using those prophylactic drugs to try to prevent Plasmodium infection. Now they're trying this new thing where they actually genetically engineer the mosquitoes to try to make them resistant to Plasmodium, and they're hoping that the mosquitoes will transfer their resistance to the wild mosquitoes. Vaccination is extraordinarily difficult to develop for Plasmodium, and the reason is because vaccines usually rely on antibodies, your body producing antibodies against the pathogen, but because Plasmodium is an intracellular pathogen and it grows inside liver and inside human red blood cells, it makes it really difficult for antibodies to find and destroy the protozoal pathogen. Our next apicomplexan is called Toxoplasma gondii. So Toxoplasma is the genus name, Gondii is the species. It causes a disease called toxoplasmosis. So Toxoplasma gondii, its natural reservoir, the only host that it can actually sexually reproduce in, is a cat. And something like 80% or more of cats are carriers of Toxoplasma gondii. In fact, if you're a cat owner, you probably have already been exposed to this, especially if your cat goes outside. So how this spreads to humans is in one of 3 ways. If you have a cat and you clean the cat's litter box and you come in contact with the cat feces, that's one way. The second way is if you're ingesting food that the cat feces is in. And if you're a cat owner, this is actually pretty common because your cat uses the litter box and then your cat walks onto the kitchen table or whatever surface, and then you didn't wash your hands or you didn't wash the table or whatever, and you eat the food, you can ingest the cyst. Or if there's a cat outside, all right, and there's an animal outside who's ingested the cat feces, now this animal, if it's a pig or a cow or whatever, has the disease, and then you eat the undercooked or raw meat that could have the cysts in it. So this is a very common disease. Like I said, almost all cat owners probably have been exposed to it. Most people are asymptomatic. But the thing is that this protozoa can actually become latent if later on in life the individual develops AIDS or another serious disease, then it can reactivate and lead to a more serious infection. For individuals that are immunocompromised, Toxoplasma gondii can lead to fever, swollen lymph nodes, pneumonia. Very rarely, but a very serious meningitis could occur. Some people actually develop neurological symptoms. This picture is just kind of showing you like what I told you, like the cysts can be found in rodents and in the environment. Cats pick it up when they ingest them. And now the cat's the carrier of the Toxoplasma gondii. And then you ingest the cyst, and that's how humans can become infected. Now, the most serious concern in terms of Toxoplasma gondii is in pregnant women. Remember we talked about that storch a couple lectures ago? The T in storch stands for toxoplasma, because this is one of those diseases that's transplacental. It can spread from mother to fetus, and that's where it becomes most concerning. Now, if a woman had already been exposed to toxoplasma before she was pregnant, it's no problem, all right? It's only if the woman develops a primary infection, if they're exposed for the first time to this protozoa while pregnant. That's why they always advise pregnant women, don't clean the litter box and don't become a first-time cat owner while pregnant. Now, some of the problems that could lead to is the fetus could develop blindness. After birth, the baby could have seizures or several birth defects. And if the woman develops this disease early in the pregnancy, it can lead to a stillbirth. Our next AP complexin protozoa is Cryptosporidium. This is found everywhere. It's a very common pathogen. It can affect a wide variety of mammals, birds, and reptiles, and of course humans. And there's been estimates and studies have shown that about 25% of adults have been exposed to this at some point in their life. They can look at the antibodies, the serology, and they can see that a lot of people have had this before. This is an intestinal disease. Where we see it the most is in improperly filtered water. So I guess in the 90s, there was about 370,000 cases in just one city, Milwaukee, because they had a problem with their water filter. So all these people were getting infected with the disease. So chlorine might not necessarily kill protozoa. Remember, the cysts can survive the chlorine. So filtration is really the only way to ensure there's no protozoa in the water. There's also been some outbreaks associated with daycare centers of Cryptosporidium. Like a lot of the other intestinal protozoa, this protozoa will enter the intestinal cells, and they can penetrate the cells and cause things like diarrhea, cramps, sweating, vomiting. This one usually goes away on its own. It can become more serious, though, of course, in AIDS patients. Similar to Cryptosporidium, another apicomplexin oral to fecal transmission disease is Cyclospora. Cyclospora has been mostly associated with if you don't wash your produce properly, because it can be found on the fruit or the vegetable, or also water. There was actually recently an outbreak due to some contaminated raspberries. So it's just important that we wash all of our fruits and produce before eating them. Our final protozoal disease is Babesia. Now this is a new disease, so it's here at the very end. It's also an apicomplexin. Now this is the first ever protozoa that can be found spread by a tick. And I know that you're going to freak out, but it is actually spread by the same tick that spreads Lyme disease. So it is a newer disease. So as of right now, it's relatively rare. It's associated also with rodents because the tick picks up the disease from the rodent. Now the infection, the actual signs and symptoms actually resemble malaria, because Babesia actually will also target red blood cells, and it can potentially lead to hemolysis of the red blood cells, anemia, and fever. However, it's a lot more mild than malaria, and a lot of people actually have been shown to be asymptomatic. Similarly to malaria, we will diagnose by looking for the protozoa in a blood smear. Now, the major difference is this one is spread by a tick, malaria is spread by a mosquito, and also Babesia does not have a liver stage like the Plasmodium does.